Cancer doesn't often bring out the best in couples.
Hmm.
I can tell usually by the second or third treatment which couples are actually going to stay together and which are
Oh,
not. If you stress certain relationships in a certain way, they don't hold up.
welcome to another episode of the Doctors and Dollars podcast. I'm your host, Nate Crannell, joined today by Dr. Tiffany Troso. She is an expert medical oncologist, keynote speaker, compassionate educator, coach, and author. Excited to talk to you today. What's going well?
Thank you. Hi, so great to see you. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Um, I wanted to tell you that we're having a very big conference next week that I've been working on all week, and so I'm really excited about that. I'd love to tell you a little bit about it if it's appropriate. Is that okay?
Absolutely. Yeah. Cancer,
Sure.
I'm
So
assuming.
cancer, exactly. So I guess I should introduce myself. I'm a medical
Yeah.
oncologist. I have worked in the medical space for about 25 years. I've taken care of breast and gynecological cancers. So a medical oncologist is the person that usually gives you the chemotherapy. They often will serve sort of as the point guard of your medical oncology or your oncology journey. I am currently on sabbatical and I am doing some exciting entrepreneurship things. So this conference that I'm speaking about is through an organization called SoMe Docs, which I have become a part of. And we were tasked with the option of creating a conference, and a lot of doctors are creating conferences in special little particular niches for one another. I decided to create a conference that would be for cancer patients and their caregivers, because that's where my passion is to really help assist patients and their caregivers. I have found that despite our best intentions in the oncology office, we have so much business to take care of in terms of taking care of the patient and the cancer, that oftentimes things that are on the periphery, which might not seem as medically pressing, are often left aside. So this conference is a compilation of 19 different experts who are going to be speaking over 5 evenings. And we are talking about everything from financial toxicity from cancer treatments to what is radiation oncology and explaining that. We have a nutritionist who talks about what to eat while you're on chemotherapy and then afterwards, and she's going to give a cooking demonstration. I have people doing mindset and how to manage your social structure, how to get along at work with the diagnosis of cancer. Do you tell them or do you don't? So I'm not going to bore you with a lot more of it, but as you can see, these are all topics that, your doctor, your oncologist, myself included, would not have normally time to speak to you about. So I'm really excited to offer this out to the community. And I think it's, and we're also offering it for free. So hopefully we'll get some people that'll be able to come and see us.
Very cool. It sounds a lot more holistic than you'd think of when you think of a cancer conference or oncology or it seems like the audience is not just cancer doctors. I'm sure there'll be some on there that have something, but really it's more cancer patient and cancer caregiver, which I think is unique. I've heard of other foundations and things like that will put on live events or virtual events for cancer survivors or people currently going through the cancer treatment process,
right.
But actually have content and topics available for caregivers, I think is very unique. That's very cool. Talk to me about some of those specific topics. You mentioned financial toxicity and workplace, hey, I've been diagnosed with cancer. I now have to go to work, as I'm going through treatment. What's the dynamic of that look like? Talk about the caregiver portion of that. What are some of the things that you guys will be talking about there?
Sure. So, it's actually interesting when, in my experience over the last umpteen years, that oftentimes when patients come in for their initial consultation or until they get sort of into the groove of their treatment, so to speak, most of my consultation and most of my question answers go with the caregiver. Could be the best friend, it could be a sister, it could be mother, father, whoever, depending on, the person. But, it's very interesting. Most patients, unfortunately, have a, deer in headlight look in their face, and they're so overwhelmed that they can't absorb everything. So it's actually of the utmost importance to have a caregiver come with you, especially in your first consultation, and to make sure that you're addressing everything that the caregiver can help you with. So one of the talks I'm going to be giving will be actually targeted towards that. And I review things like how to organize your medical records, how to best document the patient's symptoms and what they're eating and drinking. And I go through a system that I've developed for my own patients, and how to communicate that with the patient's physician and healthcare team. Because oftentimes, like I said, the patient will come and say like, oh no, everything was great, because they want to get their next chemotherapy and they don't want to miss his treatment. And then the sister in the background will be like, so you have to, make sure that you're, listening to the whole story and getting the full truth from everybody. So.
Yeah. You mentioned sister there. How, in your experience in the past with your own patients, how many times is the caregiver a spouse? How many times is it like a sibling, a parent? What is there pretty equal? What have you seen?
I think it depends on the age demographics of who we're seeing. I mean, I'm drawing from my experience in the clinic, and I would say it's 33% to each. Oftentimes if somebody is within the age of 35 and 50 years old, they're coming in with their spouse. More likely than not. If someone's in their 70s, they're more likely or possibly coming in either with their spouse plus one of their children. And then sometimes there'll be in any of those age groups, there could be people that are either single or widowed and will be coming in, with a neighbor or a friend. And that's not uncommon either.
You're doing it through SoMeDocs, which is a great organization. Everything that Dr. Donna Coriel is doing over there is fantastic. She's growing a great community, providing a ton of resources. I've participated in that as well. Have had some interaction with members there. Donna's been on this podcast. Great thing that they're doing. What got you guys connected and deciding, hey, let's put it out on this platform, because this is where a lot of people need to see it?
So I joined SoMeDocs, I don't know, maybe 8 months ago, and I was just following along with her. And I have to also just give her a shout out. Dr. Coriel is a powerhouse. She is an absolute, Wonder Woman, and I really admire her and all that she's doing. She's this program that she's developed is really quite admirable, and she's actually expanding it now to include medical students and pre-med students, and trying to give them education and exposure to different options for them. So I'm not sure exactly where. I think she just had I was on, one of her mixers, or her, she'll do this like Sunday night type of a discussion event, and maybe I was on there and I suggested to her this topic and she liked it. So I'm really happy about that.
Yeah. So can people find it on the SoMeDocs website, or will it be on other platforms as well?
Yeah. So the SoMeDocs website, which is exactly as it sounds, SoMeDocs.com.
Yep.
And you would go under lectures and upcoming. If you're seeing this after the fact, then you can still actually, it's free during the live virtual event. If you're seeing this after the fact, then there will be an option to purchase some of the film to make it more evergreen for, I think, 6 months access or so. You can also find it on my Facebook page, which is all over the place. I've posted it multiple times. My Facebook group is Winning the Cancer Journey, all one word. And I have a private group that if anybody's interested, they're more than welcome to join. And I try to post a lot of information and conversational type topics that would be of interest. So
very cool. Well, wishing you a ton of luck on the SoMeDocs event. I hope you guys get a ton of attendance. You create a huge impact. I just think it's very cool that's gotten put together. It seems like maybe one of the first of its kind, which is always exciting to do. But wishing you the best in that.
Thank you.
You mentioned winning the cancer journey. So that's been something that you've had for quite some time. Tell the listeners about winning the cancer journey, what the mission is there, some of the work that you guys have done in the past, and what you hope to do, coming up in the future.
So, like I said, I'm on sabbatical right now. And so what I'm doing is actually a little bit more limited. I'm more in the expansion phase right now. And basically winning the cancer journey is my baby. It's my passion project, in which I am basically looking to do what I am performing in this conference. And so I'm looking to support and educate medical oncology patients, preferably females, because that's where I have the most experience, and their caregivers. And so I have found over the years that, for example, a patient will come in and, I was at a big institution and they would come in and be, outraged, and they want a second opinion and they want to transfer care because their last doctor won't order them a PET scan, and they're so upset about that. And understandably so. Word on the street is that the PET scan is the right test to have. And then I'll sit down with them and I'll say, well, actually, you have cervical cancer, you have ovarian cancer, or what have you, and you just had surgery 4.5 weeks ago, and a PET scan is not going to really give us that much information. And I find that a lot of the fear, anger, frustration that patients and caregivers have is often born out of lack of understanding. And also perhaps they're not getting the answers that they're asking for as well. So part of that journey and part of the way to help patients and caregivers is to A, give them the education so they know what they're asking for, and B, help them to understand the answers that they're receiving. And because oftentimes people will be, writing things down, or here's another terrible example. The government has sort of mandated that we release radiology reports, within X number of hours from the scan being done and read. So now 95% of the time, my patients are seeing their CT scan reports before I have even reviewed them.
Oh, no.
And they will then, exactly. So then they will go to Dr. Google and they will take notes and highlighting and circle and pages of notes and come in, for a couple days later, like absolutely in a panic. And I'll look at the scan and go, oh, it looks good. And they go, what? So, for example, like a very common word, physiologic. Okay, big word. Well, what does that mean? So they're talking about the physiological uptake on a PET scan in the small intestine. And so, well, what does that mean? It's a lot of garbage there's normal blood flow and activity in the small intestines. But, there's a lot of medical jargon there. And so, I don't know. At any rate, the bottom line is that you really need to look at these scans, the numbers, the whole history through your doctor's eyes, because we're trained to look at this. And I actually feel bad for patients, and I don't blame them, because if I had a CAT scan, I don't think I could wait till I see my doctor if I had access to it. But on the other hand, I really feel like they're almost doing themselves a disservice, because then they sit for 48 hours like in an absolute terror.
For sure.
I do try to always, schedule my scans very close to their following appointment, so they don't have to wait too long. I can't stand it when I hear about patients that have to wait 2 weeks for a CAT scan. So at any rate, that's just some of the examples of things that I feel that could be very helpful to patients to really understand. So, for example, in the book that I'm writing, which is also called, can you guess?
Winning the Cancer Journey.
Right? Sorry to be consistent there. I go through, a cancer patient's journey from the day something goes wrong all the way through their treatment to maintenance phase. And I walk them through, basically, what is the radiology workup? What are the different types of surgeries that they could have? What is a biopsy? What is the pathology? I talk about how to interpret a pathology report. There's a whole chapter on, specific frequently seen symptoms. I go through, what is certain types of chemo, what is immunotherapy, what is targeted therapy. And I go through this speaking as if I were speaking to my own patients. So it is written by a medical oncologist, an expert, and it is in layman's terms. And I use lots of analogies.
You answered my question. My question that kind of birthed from that was like, what angle are you writing it from? And then why from that angle? And I got to imagine that in your years of being a medical oncologist and talking one-on-one with patients, that there has been situations where you've had to talk, okay, you've had an event, now you have a diagnosis, here's what to expect. And it has to give people peace of mind to be able to have that conversation and know what step 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 are going to be. And so now you're kind of like that that little angel on the shoulder of somebody who gets diagnosed, talks with their own oncologist, but then they can also read your book and kind of say, okay, my oncologist has given me 50%. This book really fills in that other 50% that maybe that my oncologist just doesn't have time. I mean, they can't sit there with me for 3 hours and
They don't. You
give
won't
me the
get, I
whole
mean,
road. So
I try to, and it probably contributed to some of my burnout because, you only have so much time to see so many patients. And when you're trying to fill in the gaps of education, in addition to doing the medical things that are necessary to do as an oncologist, it's a lot. And our system in general is not well set up to support patients, if you ask me, but that's a whole other genre.
yeah. Well, and people just need that whole story, right? So
Yeah.
I read a stat the other day. Cancer has always been one of the top leading causes of death, in the United States over the last, let's call it century.
Sure.
I was reading something about the National Cancer Institute, and this wasn't like research before our conversation. It happened to pop up for something, but it said nearly 40% of Americans will be diagnosed with cancer at some point in their lives. That sounds like a crazy big number. Just thinking of the population and then what 40% of our population is. That's crazy. But it also said that the mortality rate of cancer has fallen 25% in the past couple decades.
True.
I feel like your book can be a huge part of that. And even everything that you're doing with Winning the Cancer Journey and everything with SoMe Docs, it sounds like people are going, 2 out of 5 people are going to get diagnosed with some type of cancer at some point. I feel like this book, you're coming out at the perfect time, when mortality rates are falling, but people still have to go through this whole process.
Right.
This has got to be a huge relief. Have any of those statistics kind of come to mind, and is that what prompted your book starting?
No, the prompting of my book starting was, like I said before, all the misperceptions and lack of understanding, the fear, the anxiety, the anger that I saw with so many of my patients and their family members. And I think education is the way. And I think that, an educated consumer is going to be happier and more satisfied with the process if they, again, are not completely in the dark. In terms of the statistic, I'm not shocked about the 40%. I'm a subspecialist, so I don't look that frequently at public, health numbers. But on the other hand, if you know the molecular biology of a cancer cell development, you actually would be amazed that we don't all have cancer all the time. Because, just to become a tumor, to become a cancer, there are abnormalities. So every cell has DNA in it, and that cell has to replicate. So it has to fix its DNA, repeat itself, and create a second cell, right? And then this happens trillion times a day. And so each time the DNA replicates itself, it has the propensity to make a mistake. And so if some of the mechanisms in the body or in that particular cell are not working properly, then the DNA mistake gets replicated. And then all you need to do is keep getting a few more mistakes in the DNA in the wrong places, and then a cancer can occur. Now, obviously, it's not that simple because we have an immune system as well, and the cancer has to develop all kinds of different abilities to survive. It's not just can it grow faster? It also has to grow the ability to get blood vessels to it and to metabolize itself, what have you. At any rate, that's bottom line is that if it's awful how often cancer is seen, but given how many different times per day, per second that a cancer could be formed, and the fact that most people are healthy and don't necessarily die of cancer, the majority still don't die of cancer, they die more likely of heart disease, right? That it's actually, our bodies do a pretty good job in general of trying to control and prevent cancer.
Yeah, you'd think the statistics are not in our favor. And I mean, you think of 400 million people in the United States, because the stats I read were just based on the United States. But to know that there's 400 million people, and each of those 400 million have trillions of, cells forming each day.
Right.
That's an astronomical number to think about. But I guess my thought, and maybe this is just my ignorance with how cancer is created, so I'll need you to educate me here for a second. But if you have a healthy cell with its DNA and it replicates to 2, then 2 to 4, 4 to 8.
Good. A lot of people don't know what you just did, by the way.
Oh, math.
It's geometric growth pattern, right?
Oh,
so as opposed to, it doubles. Each time it doubles. So 1 becomes 2, becomes 4, becomes 8, becomes 16. And so that's how a cancer seemingly grows so quickly. It'll be, the doctor it wasn't there 2 weeks ago. Well, it was
Got it.
there, but it was imperceivable. And if it went from, half a centimeter to now it's 6 centimeters, and it could be in a couple of weeks, right?
Mm.
And now it's this seemingly big tumor, but it's actually been there a long time. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you,
No,
but
no, you're
it's not
good.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It grows geometrically. So
All right, you gave me a virtual pat on the back there for knowing the geometric part, but there's still some ignorance there. So when it does that,
hmm
is it some external factor typically that causes, the 8, 16, 32, 64, all of a sudden at that replication, there's some external factor that says, hey, this DNA is going to mutate a little bit and it's going to be off. And that's kind of the genesis of cancer cells that then start replicating in that geometric fashion the same way. Is that what happens, or what is it so I guess my question, I'll simplify it, is it always an outside factor that takes normal growth and mutates it a little bit and then you have abnormal growth thereon? Or is it just genetics? Is it destiny? What is it that creates that first genesis of a cancer cell?
so everything comes from the DNA. It all
Okay.
starts in the DNA. So what causes the mistakes in the DNA, there are a lot of things that can contribute to that, right? So genetics is one of them. So you've heard of a BRCA gene, BRCA.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yep.
BRCA genes are very prevalent in certain patients and predisposes you to ovarian and breast cancer, among other things. And if you're born with an abnormality in one of the genes for BRCA, that's sort of, they call it a one-hit phenomenon. So we all have 2 copies of each DNA, right? Of each chromosome, there's 2 copies of the DNA. And so if you're born with one that's already abnormal, now all has to happen is the other one has to get hit and become abnormal, and now the cell is not functional, or it's functional and it can replicate, but it doesn't have a control. It doesn't have the normal stop. Normal cells know to stop growing or stop dividing or there's a senescence. In other words, they die off at a certain time. Cancer
Got
cells,
it.
that gets turned off and they keep growing. And that's one of the abnormalities that develops in the DNA. But each step of a cancer's development requires a new acquisition of a DNA abnormality. So for example, a cell to grow faster is 1 or 2 DNA abnormalities, right? And I'm simplifying this, and then for a cell to be able to go from where it started and then get into the bloodstream, that's another abnormality. It has to learn how to move because normal cells don't move. And then it
Yep.
gets into the bloodstream and it has to be able to survive in the bloodstream. That's another abnormality. Then it has to go and land in the liver. And it has to gain the DNA ability to be able to survive in the liver. So each of these it's a progressive thing. Just because a cancer forms into a tumor doesn't mean it always metastasizes and spreads, which is a lot of times we find it early, or B, the cancer hasn't developed the ability to spread yet, which is always a good thing. Did I answer your question? I'm not even sure.
You did. But it prompted like 5 more questions in my head. So,
Okay.
because I know you specialize in breast cancer and gynecological cancers.
Mm-hmm.
I hear the term, and I've had friends and family that have gotten breast cancer. The term metastatic breast cancer, where it spreads outside, is that type of cancer based on all the mutations and different, I guess, that sequence of mutations that need to happen or abnormalities that need to happen. Is breast cancer just more aggressive, and that's why there's metastatic breast cancer, or is there metastatic lots of other cancers that I just haven't heard on a commercial before?
There's metastatic lots of other cancers that you haven't heard of because you don't know people that have it. But, a breast cancer, how aggressive it is, there's a lot of factors that are involved in that. The hormone receptors, whether there's something else called HER2 on the outside of it, whether or not it's sensitive to estrogen on its own, whether or not it cares about estrogen. So there's how fast the cell is dividing on its own. So there's a bunch of different factors that we look at to decide how aggressive a breast cancer is. But we can actually, in a lot of different types of tumors, we can take the DNA from this cancer and actually sequence it or look at the DNA and actually tell you what are the abnormal genes that are present. And so a lot of times, we're able to target specific abnormalities in the DNA. So if the cancer cell has something wrong with protein X from gene X, we might have an antidote to X. That's targeted therapy. And so it's cutting edge, and it's really the way of the future for oncology. One of the ways of the future is going to be this targeted therapy based on the DNA of the cancer cells. or the
Got it. That
genomics,
makes
they
sense.
call it.
Very cool. Yeah, I
Yeah,
got some questions here in a little bit about innovations and things like that that people might not know about, because that's the
sure.
part that excites me, and the research and everything that's going into it. But
Hmm.
a second ago, you mentioned that the estrogen can be a factor and how that moves. Again, pardon my ignorance, but with breast cancer and gynecological, I mean, I have family friends and things like that have had double mastectomy, hysterectomies, all those types of things where
Hmm.
that was needed.
Hmm.
Um, is it fair to say, or is it unknown, or maybe I'm just dumb? But uh, are female cancers more aggressive? Is there more opportunity for cancer to spread in females based on genetics and estrogen and things like that versus men?
No, not
Kind of
necessarily. It
talk to me
really,
about that.
yeah. I mean, it sounds like the pool of people that you know have primarily had female type cancers, but
Correct. Yep.
the most common cancer is actually lung cancer,
Mm.
and that hits males and females, smokers and non-smokers. So I
Mm.
don't know that I would say that lung cancer is extremely aggressive, and there's different types
Okay.
of lung cancers. Some are more associated with smoking than others. And some of them, spread very quickly. For example, small cell lung cancer, which is often very closely related to smoking habit, has a propensity to spread even before it grows. So it could grow
Mm.
just a little bit and then it spreads somewhere else, which including the brain, for example, even before it becomes very big. So the patient might have a cough, but not otherwise feel sick, and then present actually with a seizure because the tumor is now growing in their brain before we even knew that the first one was there.
Oh
So,
wow.
and I'm sure you've heard about pancreatic cancer, which hits men and females, obviously.
Yep. My grandma had
Often,
that. Yep.
yeah, oftentimes is quite aggressive and difficult to treat. But on the brighter note, on a brighter note, we have found that there are some cancers, um, and I talk about them again in more specifics in a minute, but there are some cancers that are very what we call immunogenic, which means that we can help boost the immune system to find the cancer itself. And so our own immune system will go in and kill the cancer.
As opposed to
And
radiation just going through and burning everything.
so radiation, all right, so radiation, how radiation works. So radiation oftentimes is used either in the preventative setting. So a patient has a lumpectomy, for example, instead of a mastectomy, they only remove the tumor and they don't remove the rest of the breast. They'll often do
Mhm.
radiation to the rest of the breast to help sterilize it and prevent, new cancer or that cancer from spreading and growing. In some
Got it.
circumstances, if the cancer comes back and it's in not in too many places, sometimes they will go in and they'll do spot radiation just to the one tumor that has recurred. Or, for example, if a patient has cancer that comes back and it's painful or causing a problem and it's still accessible, we can get to it with radiation therapy, then sometimes we'll radiate that. The most common example of that would be somebody, for example, that has breast cancer, that has spread to the bone, and that bone is either at risk of breaking or is very painful. And then we can do spot radiation to that to help sterilize and let the bone heal. But you can't radiate the whole body, right? You
Sure.
can't just like radiate the lungs or radiate the whole belly. The body can't tolerate that. So,
Got it.
whereas immunotherapy goes through the blood system, right? And it can go everywhere. And so once you have your blood and your immune system fighting the cancer and recognizing the cancer, that can be life altering.
Yeah. How's the immunotherapy built? Is it based
Mm-hmm.
on the blood work and the genetics of the patient, or is it there's just kind of a general, hey, this kind of ties in with every human being, and you throw it in there and it will find it?
Yes and yes.
Okay,
So,
perfect.
so originally the immunotherapy was being looked at only certain types of cancers that had certain DNA changes. Okay, so if the cancer had hundreds of abnormalities or mutations, we call them abnormalities in the DNA, they tend to be more abnormal looking, and the proteins are abnormal, and we can stimulate the immune system to find them. So the brilliance of immunotherapy is that, let me give you another analogy. So a patient has normally a cancer could be growing somewhere and the body's immune system's just floating by it and ignoring it, How can that be? Why is it not seeing it? Well, the cancer itself is putting out what we call like a smoke screen. It's a chemical different, it's hiding basically, and the immune system
Mm-hmm.
doesn't see it. So what immunotherapy does is it actually activates the immune system to now be able to find the cancer and infiltrate it and kill it. And
Got it.
so it's really remarkable. So some of the recent studies, though, especially in the fields that I'm in, uterine and cervical, for example, we're now using immunotherapy in some situations, regardless of whether or not these special DNA changes are there. So we used to have to, we used to look at it, just say, okay, well, only if these changes are there, and then we can use immunotherapy. Now they found, for example, in cervical cancer, you don't have to have those changes. You just combine it with the chemotherapy, and it still has an advantage.
So is it kind of like a first line of defense type of thing? Like, hey, we found that you have cervical cancer. Before we do anything, let's do the immunotherapy. See how to get that flowing. No, not that.
Not unless
it's in combination of.
Well, not unless it's, now we're getting into the nitty gritty of treatment of cervical cancer, but I mean,
I like nitty gritty.
the first goal is to kill. It depends on how far the cancer is spread, right? So if the cancer is still localized, usually we'll do chemo and radiation therapy, or just radiation therapy, or sometimes we'll do surgery. A lot of times, though, with a younger woman, and we want to try and retain her organs, we will sort of take the ovaries and tack them out of the field. So in other words, like move them up. So sort of quick surgery, they tack them up. And then the patient will get radiation therapy down to the uterus, to the womb, and the cervix itself to help kill off the cancer that's there. And you move the ovaries out so that they don't go into menopause, because the radiation will kill the ovaries, basically. Now, if the cancer has spread already and it's, in the lungs or it's in distant places in the body, then we go through just systemic treatment. We usually would only give intravenous treatments for that.
Got it. Here comes Nate's ignorance again, because you're saying all this great information and I'm soaking it up, and then it just prompts more questions. But let's say a woman develops, and we'll just speak on the women's side of things. That's your specialty. But let's say a woman develops cervical cancer, doesn't know it yet, doesn't catch it, hasn't really felt a lot of symptoms. It spreads. All of a sudden now it's in the lungs, or let's say the liver. Does it now become cervical cancer and liver cancer, or is there ways that you guys could, test the liver and be like, based on, this genetic makeup, this is actually cervical cancer? And then you go down to the cervix, you're like, yep, here it is. Is that how it works? Or does she now have two types of cancer?
No, she has one kind of cancer. And that's an excellent question, and a very common question. And I always try and clear that up for my patients. If the cancer spreads to your lung, you don't have lung cancer. You have breast cancer spread to the lung, or you have cervical cancer spread to the lung, which also means that original cancer is metastatic or stage 4, because it's spread to a new organ. It's not, in the case of cervical cancer, it's not very common for us to not know about the original tumor, because patients will they might be ignoring it, but they probably have some symptoms. They either have pain with intercourse, or they're bleeding, or something. But there are cancers that, we don't know where they started. And so we find a tumor in the liver, and we do have to do a biopsy of that, and then look at the DNA and look at it under the microscope to decide where it probably came from. And then we have to do more scans and try and peel down. Sometimes we never find it. Sometimes we don't find it. And it's frustrating. And, sort of the answer to that would be, well, perhaps wherever the original tumor was kind of burned out, it died off, but it had already spread. So now we have metastatic cancer, but we can't find the primary tumor. But we can oftentimes find, by looking under the microscope, where we think it started. And that's important, because each type of cancer, depending on where it came from, is treated very differently. So the chemotherapy that we give for colon cancer is very different than the chemotherapy that we give for uterine cancer, for example.
Got it. And to the point you made earlier, and this is me just learning more about cancer, is it does die off at some point. Once it can become tumorous, but you said once it spreads, the kind of the origin point, it can die off at that point. And so it's
rare, but yes, it can happen. Okay. It is rare.
Gotcha.
So for example, I've seen, probably 10 times in my career, it's not frequent. Again, a patient will have a metastatic lymph node under their arm, and we do a biopsy of it, and it comes back as breast cancer. We do MRIs of the breast. We look at the breast everywhere we can. We can't find the primary cancer.
Mhm.
Maybe it burned out. Maybe the immune system took care of that, but it had already spread. And it's hard to say exactly. But a lot of time it's not never. It's a small percentage, but I have seen it.
Let's go back in time like 50 years, where the death rate was much higher with different forms of cancer. So the mortality rate of cancer, we said it had fell about 25% in the last 2 decades. Do we chalk that up to like the better treatment technologies that you've been talking about, over the last 10 minutes? Or is it people are just becoming more aware of the things that can cause cancer, and then they're just avoiding those things, too much time in the sun, smoking cigarettes, things like that. Which one do you think is more relative to why that mortality rate has dropped in the last couple decades?
I think you didn't mention the number one reason.
Okay,
which is early screening and detection. Screening and early detection, right? So, patients are now getting mammograms on a regular basis. Women, get their mammograms religiously. And as a matter of fact, one of the national guidelines has just been improved, in my opinion. So women are now recommended to start getting screening mammograms at the age of 40, which is younger than it used to be. Colon cancer screening. Everybody's, you're supposed to get it every 5 to 10 years, depending on your risk. We have now actually lowered the age to 45. It used to be 50 for most of my career. And recently, they lowered it to 45.
I don't like hearing that.
Yeah. Okay. Good cleaning and flushing. Never hurt anybody.
Yeah.
Pap smears, right? Women get pap smears. As soon as they become sexually active or at the age of 21, they start doing routine pap smears on women. We have the HPV vaccines, right? I mean, if you ask me, no woman in this country, in the world for that matter, but in this country where we have access to good healthcare and vaccines, should ever have to die of HPV-related cervical cancer anymore. We have a prevention. We know it's almost a direct correlate. HPV, certain subtypes of HPV, which is a virus, infects the cervix. X number of years later, can develop into cervical cancer, and that infection is prevented by the vaccine. So
what's the statistic on HPV as far as it's still being around and it being contracted and leading to potentially death then?
I don't know the prevalence of it in the that's a public health type of question. What I can tell you is that the majority of cervical cancers are what are called squamous cell carcinomas that are directly caused by HPV. So, 80% of all cervical cancers are squamous cell caused by HPV. So it's a high proportion. And it's very infected, and it is very common. I don't know the exact statistic, but the problem is that men who probably are infected with it and their organs are not aware of it. And then if they're not using protected intercourse, then the woman is immediately at risk. I can't tell you, it's sad, but I can't tell you how many patients I've had that, will contract cervical cancer, HPV related, in their 60s. Okay. And they're married and they're there with their husband, and they both swear that they've only ever been with each other. Something's wrong there.
Yeah. So it's either not only been with each other, or husband's had it, never.
Yeah, but how did he get it? You're not born with it.
Okay, good point. Yep, good point. Yep. That's an awkward conversation.
I don't touch that. I mean, God knows. Once the cancer's formed, what's the point? I mean, the last thing I want to do is rock their marriage but it's, it is an interesting situation. Anyway, and not uncommon.
For sure. A different type of uncomfortable conversation than you typically want to have. I know when I was a financial advisor in a past life, sitting next to a husband and wife and talking about like life insurance, for example. I was like, hey, we've got all your investment accounts taken care of. Those are humming right along. Let's talk about legacy planning, life insurance. And then you can tell the husband and wife have not discussed what they want to do from an estate planning, legacy planning, because you have the wife that's like, I want to make sure all our kids are taken care of, and I want to create generational wealth and all the good things. And then the husband's like, yeah, I just want enough that can put me in the ground, pay for the funeral, and that's it. And you get the dirty looks with each other and the elbow, and it's always gets a little awkward. But those are financial conversations. A cancer conversation is completely different, especially when the origin story of it is a little unknown, especially with a 60-year-old couple. That's kind of tough.
Yeah, cancer doesn't often bring out the best in couples.
Yeah.
You can, I can tell usually by the second or third treatment which couples are actually going to stay together and which are
Oh.
not. Because that you'd be surprised if you stress certain relationships in a certain way, they don't hold up,
Mm-hmm.
and that's very
Yeah, no,
sad.
yeah, I mean, finances are the number one cause of divorce, in our country. Number two, I believe, is medical. Um,
Yeah.
and then medical in turn is the number one cause of bankruptcy. So it makes it very challenging
Is that
from a
true? I didn't know
relationship
that.
standpoint.
Medical care is
Mm-hmm.
the number one cause of bankruptcy?
Yeah, most
Huh.
bankruptcies are because of medical. They can't afford their medical bills and things like that.
Oh,
It's wild.
that's horrible.
Yeah.
That shouldn't be.
Yeah, it shouldn't be, right? But to your point, I mean, when you can figure out by after a couple treatments that's where you can see who's going to make it and who's not going to make it. Is that something that you think is going to be part of the winning cancer journey story? Is that going to be in the SOMI Docs conference? Is that topic going to be brought up at all?
No, not specifically. We do have a talk
Okay.
that's going to center around how to choose your support system and how to ask for help. And so, there will be, we do have somebody, a social worker, that's going to be talking about how to create and to form your best support group. Because, sometimes it's very difficult for families, they have competing, conflicting problems going on in the house. And so, the patient's cancer might only be one of the problems. What if, they have a child at home that's disabled, or they have, grandma's living with them and, dementia and she needs all kinds of attention and care. What if the spouse is sick as well? What if the spouse just lost his job and they don't have insurance, or there's everything under the sun. So yeah, I
For
think
sure.
it's very important to make sure that you have good support, and yeah, and it doesn't have to necessarily be just direct family. Sometimes you have to reach out to friends, and I've actually had patients where, they didn't have family or friends in the area, or were not alive, and their pastor would become their healthcare proxy.
Oh.
So, you find support where it grows.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What would you say would be a few characteristics that someone that would be a good support system should have?
That's tough. Organized
Mm-hmm.
and a good listener, note taker, patient, compassionate, and emotionally strong, emotional fortitude, because it's a tough
I think
road.
that last one that you just said is compassionate is very good too. I think there has to be compassion there. But emotional fortitude has got to be, because you have to be stronger than the person that's going through it, essentially, because they're going to have the physiological demands of it, and
Right.
you don't have the disease, so you have to be there emotionally. You have to be twice as strong, probably emotionally,
Right.
than the person with it. So that was good. That's a good list.
Thank you. So let me just expand on the compassionate part of it a little bit, which is, it seems obvious. Well, of course I care. Of course I'm compassionate. I care. I want to help them, what have you. What I often have to explain to patients, family members, and friends is that a lot of the symptoms that the patient, this is more likely in advanced cancers, but a lot of the patient's symptoms that they're suffering from are not their fault and are not necessarily their choice. So for example, you have a family member who has advanced X cancer. When you have advanced cancer, it lets off certain growth factors, hormones in your body that decreases your appetite, and you don't feel like eating. Or you could have fluid building up in your belly and you feel full really easily. Or you've lost your sense of taste, or you don't want to drink anything because you feel nauseous, right? So all of these things a family member is frustrated by, because it's our duty as the family member or the loved one to make sure that they're nourished and they're hydrated and and they're eating. And every time you go to the doctor's going to say, well, how's she eating? she eating anything? And the patient would be like, yeah, I'm eating okay. And the sister's like, she's not eating.
Mm.
And it becomes a source
Yeah.
of conflict between them. And it's sad because, you know, the loved one wants the patient to eat. Patient can't eat. Like, she really can't. Like, it's not a mind over matter thing. Like, that she just can't. She feels sick. So it's very important for the doctor to step in and see what things she can do to help the patient be able to eat, as opposed to somebody trying to just will them to eat. Like, you have to eat because I said so. Does that make sense? So
Yeah, it does make
that's
sense.
a tricky part of compassion that, you know, you have to understand a little bit about what's going on.
Yeah, which goes back to the note taking. I mean, that kind of falls on the doctor, but it falls on the caretaker to be able to say, okay, they have this type of cancer. It's known there's going to be decreased appetite. There's going to be lack of thirst, things like that, where it's like, these things are going to happen. You need to be aware of it. Don't get frustrated at the patient for not being hungry. And
Right.
then you caretaker, don't feel guilty, if they don't eat, because you feel like, well, it's part of my job is to feed them, make sure they're fed.
Right.
Don't feel bad if they don't.
Right.
Which that would be tough. That there's some psychology there too that would be tough.
Yep. Tough situations.
Tough situation. Well, I want to end this fantastic conversation with a little pop culture, if that's okay with you.
Okay.
So you recently, I don't remember the exact date, so I'm going to apologize, and we'll put it in the episode notes. But you did an interview with Newsroom about Princess Kate Middleton, and gave your insights on her cancer diagnosis. So for folks that didn't know it or just heard, I heard she was sick. What was her diagnosis, and then what's her presumed treatment that you think she'll be going through?
So both questions I can't really answer, unfortunately. I wish I could. It's like $1 million question. She didn't say. She didn't say what kind of cancer it is. It hasn't been released yet. I haven't seen a whole lot in the social media or the news about her recently. I don't know if she's lost her hair or not. Do you? Did she lose her hair?
See, I was the one that thought she'd been diagnosed and it was out there. So that shows how much I pay attention to pop culture.
So whatever it was, it's in the belly, right? And so the most likely, more common things that would happen to a young woman in the belly would be either a colon cancer, a small intestine cancer, a uterine or ovarian, right? Those are, whatever it was, sounds like they had to operate quasi-emergently, or, they didn't wait on operating. And then she had to heal from that surgery. So it must have been a pretty large surgery before she could start chemotherapy. Chemotherapy, as I mentioned earlier, differs depending on where the cancer started. So colon cancer is treated very differently than an ovarian cancer, for example. I don't know her family history. I don't know if she has a genetic predisposition or any other risk factors for getting early cancers. So it's hard for me to give a guess. The reason I asked about the hair was because ovarian and uterine cancer usually is treated with a drug called paclitaxel, and another drug called carboplatin, for example. And paclitaxel causes you to lose your hair. Unless it's given in a very specific fashion and the patient's also wearing a cold cap, but that's a whole other thing. GI cancers, colon cancers, are treated with a drug called Fulfox, often treated with Fulfox, which does not usually cause hair loss. So I can't speculate. I can only tell you what's most common in the belly at her age. But you know what? Honestly, I don't know. I just wish her well. And I pray she's doing well with her treatment and her kids are not come out of this unscathed as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was good insight. For not knowing, that was pretty good insight. So I'm impressed. But
thank you.
Last thing, just to wrap up. I mean, you mentioned the live virtual cancer conference on the SoMeDocs website.
So proud.
Facebook events with Winning the Cancer Journey. Sounds like that is a growing living thing that's going to get bigger and bigger. What's next in that? As people listen to this and they really like what you have going on, what's next with Winning the Cancer Journey?
So first I have to decide if I'm going to go back full time.
Oh, sabbatical. Yeah, you're right.
Clinical practice.
Let's start there. You make that decision, then what's next?
Right. That's that's a complicated decision. It has to do a little bit with some of my own medical issues. So, I mean, ultimately, if I'm not practicing clinically on a regular basis, I would love to do virtual second opinions I would love to do, I'm hoping to do coaching and concierge type work, so that,
Mhm.
you know, this is born out of the fact that, throughout high school, high school, college, medical school, residency, fellowship, my kids, your sphere starts to grow larger. And, it's not unknown amongst all these people that I work at Memorial Sloan, that I worked at Memorial Sloan Kettering, and that
Mhm.
I was a great reference. And so, it came out of the idea that I was probably getting at least, a phone call a day from a friend or family member who has a new diagnosis of cancer and that needs to be sort of guided and given recommendations to. I'm not necessarily going to treat them, but I will help put them in the right direction. I'll read their pathology report for them and say, okay, you got to see Dr. G, you got to see this doctor, you need to get a CT scan or what have you, and just move them in the right direction. And
Mhm.
I mean, I've done that for innumerable people that, maybe 1 to 10 degrees of separation from me, but somehow got to my cell phone. And I just realized that this is something that's really necessary. I think it's a very important thing, and it really gives people peace of mind if an expert looks at it and says, oh, this is what you need and this is where you have to go. Take a deep breath and say, okay, this is what I'm doing next. And it helps give clarity and confidence to the people involved. So
Absolutely, that is exciting. I mean,
yeah,
there's definitely a business there. I mean,
sure.
as you were mentioning, second opinion, coaching, concierge. That's aside from the Doctors and Dollars podcast. That's what I do. I co-founded a company called Grand Vision Companies. We work
Uh-huh.
with physicians, and that's what we do. We provide financial second opinions for physicians. We
Oh,
give them coaching. We provide concierge investments, things like that. Like literally, those three words are what we do. We help physicians. You're kind of doing it on the other end, helping patients in the medical
huh.
space. So very
Interesting.
very convenient choice of words that you
Thank you.
just used there. So I didn't know, maybe you read our website or something and you're like, yeah, I'm going
Nope.
to throw this in there and just be funny. But oh
Nope.
man, the world's full of coincidences. But um, Tiffany, pleasure having you on.
Thank you.
This conversation was exactly what I was expecting.
Oh, good.
Again,
Good.
I know a little bit about a lot of things. Cancer wasn't quite one of them, other than people I know. So I was excited to sit down with you and ask you all the questions that I did. So I appreciate you taking some time out of your day to do that.
This was fun. I appreciate it. You challenged me a
Yeah,
little also. It's good.
that's that's
It's good.
always a good thing. You
Yeah.
bet. Well, I appreciate you again, and I look forward to when our paths cross again in the future.